In order to explain the concept of polymedia education based on the cathedral model expressed in the title, I must draw on my own experience. Between 1996 and 2010, I worked in high school teaching Polish language. From the beginning of my career, I looked beyond the traditional literary circuit with a view to the correspondence between literature and other culture texts, especially popular culture, film, music, or games, which were then entering the market. At that time, in early 2002, a short fantasy animation film directed by Tomasz Bagiński entitled The Cathedral was released. The film gained notoriety rather quickly, as it won an Oscar, American Film Academy Award. Inspired by the aesthetics of computer games, the animation seemed the perfect context for the medieval themes discussed in Polish classes. During the screening with the students, two things stopped me. Firstly, the aesthetics. Tomasz Bagiński makes no secret of his inspiration from contemporary art. In the film, the tree-shaped weaves of the cathedral's columns and vaults are stunning, reminiscent of the churches painted by Zdzisław Beksiński in 1980s, and the architectural monumentality of the building of Gaudi's unfinished Sagrada Familia project. The music in the film is mysterious and fascinating, choral, gentle, sacredly splayed across the aisles, where light carried by men awakens dancing shadows between the skeletal columns. Bagiński's cathedral proves to be a living text, and not only in the metaphorical sense. And here is the second point. The story of the pilgrim, as told, is thoroughly medieval. The film's protagonist is a typical everyman who travels the world. He heads towards a huge building, the architecture of which is reminiscent of a medieval cathedral. He opens the door and goes inside. Lighting his way with a torch, he walks along gigantic columns that seem alive to him. The cathedral is a world. In its extremely complex and multimedia construction, the cathedral allows itself to be read like a text. One can read it through the prism of theology and the Christian symbols hidden in it. One can perceive the social order that mark the place of individual states, ordering the space also symbolically into the earthly and the heavenly. Finally, one can see the cathedral as a book and a picture book at the Bible pauperum, which fulfilled its didactic role for the illiterati. This last thought made me think of the situation of the contemporary polymedia work. The parallel between the cathedral as a Bible pauperum and the contemporary multimedia digital space hardly needs further explanation. It has been well described by J. David Bolter, among others. The line of interpretation proposed that allowed me to specify the question of the parallels between the medieval cathedral as a figure of reading the world and today's transcultural and polysemiotic conception of the transmission of meaning, which is not without its influence on education. Watching Bagiński film, I realized that up till now, I had asked the wrong question. It is not about what we can say about the Middle Ages by looking at the ruins of the world, but what is important is what this Middle Ages can say about us, here and now. Paraphrasing Nietzsche's famous saying, "When you look into the abyss, it also looks at you." One could say, when we look at the cathedral, it also looks at us. So what does it say? Firstly, the cathedral invites us inside, allowing us to immerse ourselves in its space. Entering the interior of the cathedral offers the opportunity to go around the naves in person, to walk through the portico, to stop at the wall inscriptions, to follow the line of the pointed arches as they ascend towards the weaves on the ceiling, or finally to catch the colorful reflections of the stained glass window. The cathedral, in its architectural uniqueness, allows itself to be read on the move, requiring the user to be active to act, to endeavour on both the kinetic and intellectual level. This active reading of the cathedral's text triggers in the passerby a memory that reaches back to acquired knowledge, to intuitive knowledge, and to knowledge which is offered to him by the signs and symbols distributed in the space, the cathedral, demanding a certain effort to cognition and the discovery of the mystery. Secondly, the cathedral offers a transmedia narrative broken up between different types of message, the multiplicity of messages correspondent to the diversity of form, from form iconography through the matter of sculpture to the melody of the Gregorian choral, accompanying the prayers usually carrying a similar message content. In medieval time, the cathedral offered its viewer diffuse knowledge, made available through various messages, with varying degrees of focus, from frescoes to inscriptions to mathematical of color symbolism. At the level of reading, it gave the impression of being somewhat fragmented, but through a very clear foundation of the theological nature that at the same time gave meaning to everything inside. From the structure, composition, and facade, it gave coherence to the message. It is not difficult to notice the analogy here between the Gothic architectural structure and the construction of new media. In the case of the transmission of culture through education, this analogy can be reduced to the most visible similarities present in hypertextual structure, immersion, and transmediality. All these properties of the new media enforce a certain method of navigating text and their hypertextual interpretation based on multi-phase readings. It allows the realization of the activities characteristic of the new audiovisual attitude in accordance with the properties of the new media. It makes the user a co-creator of meanings, allows the individualization of the process of cognition and learning, gives the possibility to enter deeply into the analysis of the text while using a wide spectrum of references, contextual, hyperlinks, formally heterogeneous. The notes contain textual information, but also graphic and audiovisual information. Therefore, reading the information placed in the notes rather involves decoding messages with different semiotic origins. Reading such a note is a typical practice for new media transmediality. These messages are not related to each other in a linear way or even as a mathematical set, but are linked by a network of association, each of which can be triggered almost at random, making the reference the center of an ongoing narrative. It is perhaps difficult to imagine that kind of knowledge transmission at the basis for the organization of popular education. Nevertheless, as Mary Laurie Rain argues, reading hypertext requires the user to be dynamically active in the brain, as he or she plays a game with the text, building a narrative of interest out of a polyphonic and dialogic structure, and thus engaging in the reading process. However, the analogy drawn between the spatial structure of digital media and the architecture of a cathedral. This is intended to help construct a new concept of education, requires some elaboration. Undoubtedly, the advantages of new media are the already mentioned properties of new media. They activate and motivate the user, requiring the user to act, so that he or she can inscribe this reading of text into own experience. Surfing the internet has a certain casualness written into its identity and randomness of the information or solution encountered. How then can we reconcile this intuitive drifting through an ocean of information with the purposeful action of education? Should we try to construct a map which to mark out landmarks, allowing up to direct ourselves in the vast space of knowledge? Should be certain readings these milestones? Or maybe fundamental attitudes to modern civilizations such as freedom, equality, solidarity, and others should rather form the basis of humanist education? Pillars are not about ready-made solution or text, but the structures on which a culture supports itself. I think of them as milestones, without which it is difficult to explain today's civilization. They can be looked at from the perspective of the cultural sources, the Greek, Roman, and Judeo-Christian tradition, which, like it or not, have determined the cultural canon for at least 2.5 millennia. The way of thinking about the world and human is determined by these three perspectives. But the point here is not to start every humanistic activity from scratch, but to enter into the depths of contemporary pop culture messages in order to have a point of reference as a support, perhaps a counterpoint, for the issues at hand. The key to understanding the new educational model is therefore its multisensory nature. As in the cathedral, the viewer was subjected to a multisensory impact. Let me explain it. He could experience not only the illumination of light, perceive the after images resulting from the play of light in the colored stained glass windows, look at the iconographic elements around on the walls and buttresses of the buildings, but could also hear the singing coming from the choir of clergymen praying the hymns, could touch the texture of the bas-reliefs, copper engravings, velvet curtains separating the different parts of the naves of chapel, could feel the incense burning at the main altar. So the concept of polymedia education is about linking aesthetics and emotional experience with cognitive activity. It can be achieved the overlapping of different semiotic representation of the same content. It's therefore a question of constructing an educational situation in such a way that the viewer can move from a film to a text, from a song to an artwork, discovering shared meanings and joining in a communal understanding through different levels, and as was the case in the Bible pauperum. To make education polysemiotic similar to the medieval cathedral, it means to allow the issue or problem to be interpreted in different codes through different types of messages and using multiple sensory experiences, not only through traditional reading of the text. The contemporary student enters the cathedral of education like a medieval inhabitant of Christianitas. He has heard Latin, but he does not fully understand it. He is more impressed by the images, highly suggestive, even hyperreal, which leave no doubt as to the message and fin it with the ideology established in cultural transmission. Finally, he is captivated by the vastness of the space and absorbs it with all his sense, the symbols and signs of narrative in which he himself is inscribed, just like the protagonist of Tomek Bagiński's animation mentioned before. The unfolding texts resemble a hypertextual constellation. Starting from associative and highly contextualized reading, one can navigate towards the pillars, stopping and successive notes. This somewhat guided surfing builds up and grid of meanings that only became culturally defined in relation to the buttress. It is easy to see that the proposed learning model has the structure of a branching constellation, a network linked by nodes, which are places of commonality such as context, code, team, and so on. Each node links to the next because its structure always has an associative structure, and yet, as the construction of the cathedral shows, it grows out of the pillar. In the final perspective, therefore, the aim is to develop a mechanism that will induce in students a state of constant suspicion of the text. It will provoke contextual reading, building a broad coalition of meanings, connection between text following the Bakhtin's theoretical concept, a library of intertext. At the same time, deep reading by problematizing, posing questions, raising anthropological and existential issues that situate the students subjectively in relation to the themes and issues raised is important. One can understand this learning situation as Nicholas Carr sees it as a perpetual construction site, for similarly, visiting a cathedral takes a long time. It takes time to perceive its complex structure, all the relationships, to look at the details, to understand the individual inscriptions or iconographic forms. Moreover, visiting the cathedral is linked to an experience, a personal experience that depends on the emotions of the moment, on personal perception. When we enter a cathedral, we look up. Some inner imperative tells us to raise our eyes, not to pay attention to the pillars, let alone the floor. This is not to say that they are unimportant, even perhaps the most important. Without them, there would be none of this whole architecture. Yet it is what is attractive that attracts the eye. Education must function in the same way, starting from dazzle, awe, amazement, to then slowly discovering and perceiving the sources on foundation and these attractions.